So today we'll be talking about chapter 17, section 1, and it's titled The Origins of Progressivism. And we're going to be learning about political, economic, and social changes in the late 1800s and how our country eventually adopted a broad progressive series of reforms. Now, progressive, the root of that word is accountability. Encouraging the government to hold businesses accountable for the way they treat their workers, but also the way that our government works. It's the movement to make our government more responsive to the people. And as we learn about this, I think there are interesting parallels to politics today that I hope you can relate to anyway. Okay, so again, the progressive movement was the term given to these efforts to reform the way that businesses operate, the way that government responds to the people. And it was a movement not only in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but it's really a movement that continues today. And the effort to reform at this time had four basic goals. Number one, to protect the social welfare of our citizens. Because while the gross domestic product was going up, while our nation was acquiring more wealth, the concern was that wealth was being acquired at the very top, and that most Americans were desperately poor, the working poor. The question is how to fix that. Secondly, moral improvement. In fact, when we talk about the effort to reform morality in our country, what we're really talking about is prohibition at this time. Remember, we talked about the Women's Christian Temperance Union and how the movement to outlaw the sale, distribution, and consumption of alcohol was closely tied into domestic violence, and how women who were largely powerless at this time politically saw this as an opportunity to perhaps improve the quality of their lives. Secondly, economic reform. For example, another progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, once said that, quote, without the watchful, resolute interference of the government, there can be no fair trade between the business and the individual. So economic reform in terms of making businesses not only treat their workers decently, but how do we prevent the growth and spread of monopolies? Because if an industry controls, if a business controls an entire industry, then that not only limits and stops competition, which we know drives business and progress, but it's also dangerous because a monopoly can charge whatever they want for a product. A monopoly can take advantage of their workers, can do basically anything, and buy governments. For example, like the cartoon I showed you with Rockefeller and how he was essentially controlling the United States government in many ways. And then lastly, fostering efficiency. Think of the assembly line with Henry Ford that we'll get into in a moment. But also think about how can we do things better, not only in business, but also in politics. And we'll talk there about the grandiose belief, about the idea that we can foster efficiency in industry, we can foster efficiency in our political realm as well. And so I'm going to be breaking these four goals down for you today. We'll start with social welfare. You may remember Jane Addams, amazing lady, a lady that I would encourage you to study further if you haven't picked a topical project yet. She took it upon herself to start the Settlement House Project. It was a group of community centers in cities dedicated to helping poor children. You know, there were countless orphans, numerous poor families that couldn't provide the basic necessities of life. And so the settlement house movement was very successful. You know, people opened their wallets to donate to her cause, and she was able to help get many poor children off the streets. It also inspired a number of other movements. There were movements like this all over the country. In fact, Florence Kelley, a famous political activist, was a compassionate advocate for women and children. And she wanted to do in the public realm what Jane Addams had done in the private realm. Florence Kelley, another amazing woman to study, helped pass laws prohibiting child labor because at one time there was nothing illegal about hiring a 4-year-old and paying them 1/4 of what you would pay an adult male. And that was perfectly okay. And families were in a position where they were having to hire their children out. Not only is that very dangerous for a child, but that's cruel. Florence Kelley certainly believed so. And so she helped to get these laws passed to prohibit child labor. She also helped get laws passed to limit the number of hours a woman could work during a day so that she would have the opportunity to be home with her family. Because remember, the norm at this time was a 16-hour workday. A 16-hour workday. Can you imagine? Secondly, moral improvement. Some felt that the poor should uplift themselves by improving their behavior. Remember, we talked about social Darwinism, how some actually looked down on the poor and blamed them for their own circumstances. And some felt that by improving the morality of our country, that would also reform our country. And one of the probably more practical elements of this was prohibition. Would become eventually the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Prohibition was the movement to ban alcohol, to both ban the production, the consumption, and the distribution thereof. And it was spearheaded once again by a group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So the next of our 4 goals that we're talking about is economic reform. You see, the 1893 panic was started when competing railroads practiced shady business deals which eventually collapsed the American economy. And when these businesses, which were really too big to fail, did fail, it caused a depression that put 1/4 of our nation out of work, that led many to leave the East Coast and seek a new life out west. But it also raised concerns about how can we prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. In fact, many, and this is a common experience around the world, that when an economic situation becomes desperate, people turn to the extremes of politics, either the far right or the far left. For example, in Italy, an economic collapse such as this caused people to turn to the fascist Mussolini. In Germany, again, an economic depression is really what helped Hitler rise to power. And an economic crisis in this case led many Americans to doubt the feasibility of a democratic system of government. And so many did turn to communism or socialism, or certainly when fascism became popular in the 1920s, there were fascist American movements. Now, one of the beauties of this country is that we do have freedom of press. And even though there were these scary movements going on in our country, the press, journalists, still had the right to expose this, still had the right to criticize our government and expose corruption in both politics and business. Next, efficiency. Many experts hoped to apply the scientific method to society. to not only make the workplace more efficient, but also the government more responsive. And for example, the grandiose belief that I was talking about was to use social science and study time management to make the workplace more efficient. And people began to study the workplace. How can we increase productivity without increasing cost? And this is where the assembly line method was developed. It sped up production by essentially making people work like machines. In fact, the term robot was first coined in reference to the manufacturing assembly line. By reducing complex tasks to their simplest element, people were able to speed up progress. And this is a horribly depressing way to work, but from a business owner's perspective, it does increase productivity. But it also causes high worker turnover, because imagine, you have set out to get an education so that you can use your mind instead of your back. You've set out to get an education because you hopefully want a rewarding career, something that you can be proud of, something that you can invest your energy into, as opposed to doing simple tasks. If you've ever worked in fast food, that's an assembly line production method. It's also horribly depressing and mind-numbingly dull to do the same simple task over and over and over again. Many of the unskilled jobs you'll have available when you turn 16 will be assembly line methods. Think of Walmart or Ingalls, where you will do the same repetitive task over and over again. And I'm going to make a prediction. You're going to get a job like that, and you're going to quit within 6 months. At some point, most people have that type of life experience. Maybe you'll be the exception. However, the rule is, generally, you'll have some type of job like that where you will become dissatisfied because of this practice. I wanted to show you this political cartoon, speaking of corruption. This is from the book Octopus by Frank Norris, and it was a critique of the Standard Oil Company. And the Standard Oil Company was made to represent an octopus, and how it had its tentacles, if you look at the cartoon carefully, into politics, into the people, into even war and peace, and how governments can manipulate or be manipulated by businesses. And next I wanted to show you this picture. And this one's a little scary as well. Because imagine you're working in a place like this. Your life, 8 to 12 hours of your day might be reduced to a repetitive, simple task that you must do over and over and over again. And you must meet a quota, and if you don't do that task quickly enough, you will be replaced by someone who will. And that is your life. Again, somewhat depressing. Perhaps the selling point for these types of jobs is they did often pay better than alternatives, and so people would accept that so that they could provide for their family. Next, much of the progressive movement was about reforming government. Reformers hoped to make government more efficient and more responsive to our voters. And how do we do this? How do we ensure that people vote? I haven't got to look at the stats on this election yet, but I would assume that it's not much different than previous elections, that roughly half of Americans voted. I can't say that for a fact until I look. Uh-oh. All right, so we were talking about how reformers were trying to make the government more efficient, in particular more responsive to voters. And there are several different ways that this was accomplished in the early 20th century. Of course, this is still an ongoing movement. I can't say that we have entirely fixed this system. But in terms of local government, many cities would adopt local governments with commissions of experts. For example, in the state of North Carolina, many cities and towns use the council manager system. For example, our County Board of Commissioners chooses our manager for the town of Hendersonville. There are several different reform mayors that I'd like to highlight who are individuals who tackled corruption in their time. Hazen Pingree, mayor of Detroit, made it his goal as mayor to tackle the tax system, to make it more fair, to tackle transit fares and even corruption within his local government. Tom Johnson also fought to try to get better regulation of businesses in their particular towns. But also at the state level. Reformers attempted to push for state laws to regulate large businesses. Because if you remember anything about the labor movement from previous chapters, often the government would either turn a blind eye or even send out the National Guard to dispel protesting workers. And one of the most famous mayors in terms of the progressive movement was Robert La Follette. Served as governor of Wisconsin for 3 consecutive terms and made it his goal as mayor to attack big business. And then lastly, working children. As I've told you before, child workers would often receive 1/4 of the pay of the average adult male worker. And they were often in high demand for several different disturbing reasons. Number one, children are smaller, and so they would often be recruited to crawl into pipes to clean them. They had smaller hands, so they could handle small parts better. The National Child Labor Committee was commissioned to gather evidence of harsh conditions and how children in particular were treated very poorly in the workplace. Labor unions were also a part of this movement to outlaw child work, not out of compassion, but for a desire to remove a competition. Labor unions argued that children's wages lower all wages. And so to prevent competition for employment, they wanted children out of the workplace. These various groups pressed the government to ban child labor in particular, but also to limit hours of children, because it would not be until later that child labor would be outlawed altogether. I wanted to show you a couple of photographs real quick. This is a child worker in a textile mill. Notice they're barefoot. Notice the dangerous machinery around them. And then imagine the long hours that they would be expected to work, and the fact that their family depended on them to keep this job, despite how dangerous or difficult it might have been. This is a picture of a 4-year-old child skinning potatoes. Once again, all day, every day. That's this young girl's life. No chance for school. Her family can't afford it. This is the average American of 1900. Several different successes in the early 1900s of the progressive movement. A couple of cases. Muller versus Oregon. The Supreme Court upheld the right to limit women to a 10-hour workday. Bunting versus Oregon upheld the 10-hour workday for men as well. And reformers also worked for and fought for and pushed for the right for workers' compensation. If you are injured or killed in the workplace, you now have the right to be compensated, or your family in the case of your death. And that was fought for, ladies and gentlemen. And lastly, elections. The state of Oregon was the first to adopt the secret ballot. And I am grateful for that, the right that you have to keep your political beliefs to yourself. It is a matter of public record if you voted or not, so you can actually look up and see that I did early vote last Tuesday, I believe. And I'm pretty sure you should be able to even find my name on there. But it is a secret, or at least it's your personal choice to disclose who you voted for. A number of measures that have made politicians more responsive to voters. That's one of them. Your right to keep your beliefs to yourself. Next is the initiative, the right to petition. And that petition can even become a referendum on the state ballot, or even to recall. The voters, and this has never occurred before, but the voters of a nation can choose to recall an elected official. The voters of a state have done this several times before in different states. Again, the initiative is a bill proposed by the people, not by the lawmakers. So if you feel powerless in the government, understand that we are a democracy, and these measures have made our nation more democratic. Because with the referendum, if you disagree with a law that is passed in your state, you have the right to seek to overturn it. But since we are a democracy, you have to convince a majority of the voters, enough of them through a formal petition, to get that added to the ballot, and it will be. And again, the right to recall. Voters have removed elected officials through an early election. Now, another movement that has made our government more responsive to voters is the political primary. And you're very aware of that process since we just finished it recently. And this allows the voters, not the party leaders, to choose their candidates. And lastly, one significant constitutional amendment that came out of this era and movement is the 17th Amendment. I don't know if you knew this, but previously United States senators were not elected by the people. They were chosen from among them. And this permits the popular election of senators. So in Chapter 17, we've been learning about the progressive movement. Progressivism means the movement to reform our government, to make it more responsive to voters, and to make it more inclusive for all. And by all, I mean all. Not just white males, but all. Men and women, minorities, people of different orientations, everyone, to make our government more inclusive. And so today we get to learn about a very exciting part of this movement, which is again still going on today, the movement for women's rights. And so today we're going to get to learn how women gained the right to vote, but yet many unfinished goals that we'll begin learning about throughout American 2, and we'll continue learning about, but again, the movement of women in public life. And so as a result of social and economic change, many women entered public life both as workers as well as reformers. So, women in the workforce. The idea of the cult of domesticity, the idea that a woman's ideal place was in the home, is an idea that dates back to the origins of our country, that has its roots in religion, that a woman's primary role, according to many, was that of a homemaker and a caregiver for her children. But yet, not all felt this way. Many felt, and still do certainly, that a woman, in the eyes of the law, is on equal par to a man. But yet, equality and domesticity, according to many, were at odds. Because if a woman is equal to a man, then why should she be relegated to that of a homemaker? Why should that be the expectation in her life if she is the equal of a man? But also we have to think of theory versus reality. While in theory many held the idea at this time that a woman's place was at home. In reality, most women were working. And so the luxury of a woman being at home, again, the idea is really constraining in its own nature. But to some, that concept of a woman being at home, well, most women were working outside the home, let's be honest. Most women were having to work to provide for their families because most couldn't afford to stay at home. Poor women were generally working for wages outside the home. On farms, women's roles had remained unchanged from what they had been for centuries. Women would perform household tasks, raise livestock, help with crops, generally, the traditional role of a woman that we've seen in agrarian societies since the Neolithic Revolution, if you will. And so little had changed on the farms. By 1900, 1 in 5 women held wage-based jobs. Over 1/4 of these jobs were in manufacturing. Women comprised half of all workers in the garment trade, in textiles. And remember, the largest reason for this is that employers could pay women half what they paid men for the same job. Women were also able to find jobs in offices, in stores, and in classrooms. To be a teacher at this time only required a high school education, but we must also remember that only 1.3% of Americans even had a high school education by 1900. Women could find work in business schools. Women could find work as bookkeepers, as stenographers, which is a court reporter, or as typist. So yes, women's roles in the workplace were very limited. You don't see on this list management positions. You don't see on this list the opportunity for equal pay for equal work. And even though legally those opportunities are supposed to exist today, in reality, we don't find it as often. And we'll get to that further on in US 2. Now, the statistic about 1/4 of women working in manufacturing did not apply to 1870. So you can see a little difference between 1870 and 1900, a small amount of progress, if you will. Because in 1870, we found that 70% of women workers were employed in the domestic industry, cleaning homes. It's an honorable profession. There's not a thing wrong with it. My mother-in-law cleans homes for a living. I've cleaned homes for a living. My family has done it. Again, it's an honorable profession. But I want to point out the limitations inherent when you see that of the women working in 1870, 70% of them were in domestic work. Cleaning homes, cooking meals for others. In fact, this was by far what most African American and immigrant women were doing for a living. Married immigrants could take in piecework, which means it's a form of a cottage industry where they could do work at home and sell it to industries. It's a very ancient practice, still in use at this time. And many women could also find work as boarders, meaning taking in guests in the hospitality industry, lending out rooms. Again, what I'd like to point out is these are opportunities for women. But if we were to put a list side by side of opportunities for women in 1900 and then opportunities for men, you would see a stark difference. And so the movement for gender equality is based not only on political equality, but on economic equality. If we are to have equal opportunity, that means equal opportunity for all, not just all men. And so understandably, many women get involved. Many women industrial workers sought to reform working conditions in their industries. Again, sometimes it takes a tragedy like the 1910 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire to point out terrible working conditions. But really, the women's rights movement dates back much further. Think of the strike at Lowell, Massachusetts. 800 mill girls walked off of the factory. Women also formed cultural clubs and reform groups. Many educated, wealthy women who had the time and the resources became deeply involved in this movement. Many women active in public life were also able to attend colleges for women. In fact, among college-educated women, almost half of them chose to remain unmarried, because many women in 1900 began to realize that if, in the eyes of the law, a woman is the property of her husband, many women didn't want to be a part of that. Can you imagine entering into a union in which you voluntarily agree to become the property of someone else, despite the 13th Amendment? And yet that was the understanding in the eyes of the law at that time. And so many educated women said, I want nothing to do with marriage if that means I have to become the property of my husband. And so many did work on social reforms. But can you imagine how they must have been perceived or treated or demonized? Can you imagine what the media would have said of women who chose not to marry at this time? I mean, in this day and age, when I chose to remain unmarried and I was in my mid-20s, and then as I was getting into my late 20s and I still chose to remain unmarried, choosing instead to focus on my career, in this day and age, that was still considered odd. And it's even considered more odd for a young woman to do that. Even in this day and age, they can still be the subject of comments. But can you imagine how much courage that would have taken in 1900 to do that? And so, these women reformers targeted the workplace, economic reform, workplace conditions, equal treatment, targeted housing, targeted education, because most schools at this time did not allow women. Targeted also food and drugs. For example, a female doctor in the late 1800s named Elizabeth Blackwell conducted a national survey and found that most women were very unhealthy because of the nutritional resources available to them and because of the lifestyles that they were forced to live in. One of the most famous women in this movement, who formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was Susan B. Anthony. And again, if you're looking for a good woman to study, look no further. Susan B. Anthony is a hero in the women's rights movement. She believed that suffrage, or the right to vote, would lead to a better world for women, because it would empower women to participate in the electoral process. It would lead eventually to women like Jeannette Rankin, who became the first female congressperson. Again, can you imagine what courage that would have taken? To rise above a world that views women as property and to become empowered through the vote. Now, did you know that the movement to vote for women took 70 years? 70 years. In 1848, it was decided at the Seneca Falls Convention that women would work towards the right to vote. And for 70 years, really 72 years if we want to be exact, until 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. So ladies, that should be empowering to you. But it should also encourage you to be patient, to be active in civic life. Because the movement for suffrage was a long process. Number one, women had to convince state legislatures. When the women's rights movement was rejected multiple times at the national level, women then went to the states. Did you know that when the women's rights movement petitioned, which, by the way, the movement began in Asheville, North Carolina, in our state. But did you know, which, by the way, that's where the first women's rights movement in North Carolina was held, something we can be proud of. But did you know that movement, when it petitioned the General Assembly of the state of North Carolina, that bill which women introduced was referred to the Committee on Insane Asylums? You know what that means? That means that when women requested the right to vote of the state of North Carolina, they referred it to that Committee on the Insane. They said, that's where this belongs. This movement followed a careful and methodical strategy of going state to state, of civil disobedience. You know, Henry David Thoreau believed and practiced that if you are convinced that a law is unethical, it is your moral obligation to break that law peacefully. I don't know how many times Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting. It was many. She and many others, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, believed so firmly that women should have the right to vote, they would go on hunger strikes in prison. And I actually have a rather graphic clip to show you from a movie called Ironclad Angels.
We watched that with Miss...
Yeah, of the force feeding. Yeah, and I think Miss Stewart showed it to you. Yeah, I think I've got it coming up in a second. Now, civil disobedience. Getting themselves thrown in jail. That takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage. And then finally, the end game was to push for a constitutional amendment to grant women the right to vote. So that previous clip did an excellent job of summarizing this movement. As you heard, the state-to-state movement resulted in only 4 states. 4 states granted women the right to vote. Efforts in all of the other states failed. But that's the long game, ladies and gentlemen. That's the patient approach. That's how politics works. Democracy takes time. Swift change is dangerous. Democratic change requires patience, and that's what these women possessed. They also challenged the constitutionality of the 14th Amendment at the Supreme Court. And as you heard in the clip, the Supreme Court ruled that citizenship does not automatically confer the right to vote. And so then came the movement for a constitutional amendment. Now, to get an amendment added to the Constitution is no easy task. Think of the strife required by Lincoln to get the 13th Amendment passed. It was his passion at the end of his life to see slavery ended. And even in the midst of a civil war, it was not an easy task. The 19th Amendment was voted down time and again until 1919. You know, these women shown here did more than just write a letter. They did more than just express concern. They became active. They got out. They did something. They were part of this movement. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 17, Section 3. And the title of this is Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. Now, personally, I have to be honest, Teddy Roosevelt's one of my favorites. He's an outdoorsman, and I'm automatically just identify with this person. He loved being outside. But this individual also took that love of the outdoors and applied it to conservation. And he had a deep love for our nation's natural resources. He also had a deep love for the social welfare of our people and seeing that corruption in our society was cleaned up. So personally, I like this individual. However, with any leader, there are things that we'll have to talk about that perhaps weren't the best. And so no one is perfect. But again, well, let me just show you as we get into this. We'll be talking about some of his progressive reforms. Yeah, and I wanted to start with this picture. I think it explains a lot about Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, he was an avid equestrian. He loved hunting, loved fishing, loved hiking. There are numerous pictures of this individual climbing mountains, exploring places all throughout our country. But anyway, I want to start with the speech of Teddy Roosevelt. All right, so a little about Roosevelt's background. When he was a child, he was sick all of the time. And his parents were very concerned about his health. They sent him to numerous doctors. And eventually these doctors encouraged him to adopt a lifestyle that was healthy, to eat healthy, to be active. And Roosevelt took that to heart. He became very involved in athletics. He got into boxing. He got into wrestling. He became an avid horse rider and hiker. And eventually he pursued a career in politics. He rose through New York politics, eventually becoming the governor. In fact, prior to this, he entered the military in the Spanish-American War in 1898. He commissioned his own company called the Rough Riders, and they won quite a bit of fame for themselves throughout the Spanish-American War. In New York, Roosevelt was a very successful politician and governor. The political bosses found they could not control him. Roosevelt refused to be manipulated or bought by the corrupt political machines of the time. And eventually he was urged by his party to run for vice president. Roosevelt ran on the ticket as vice president under William McKinley. McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt became the youngest president of the United States at 42 years old. His strong leadership and his visibility, he traveled around the country, endless sources of energy, helped him to create a modern presidency. He was very popular. He was very loved by the people. But he was also very passionate about cleaning up corruption in business at this time. He supported the federal government's role in intervening between conflicts of business and government, and often state governments were not powerful enough to stop these corrupt businesses from operating within their country. Roosevelt's plan is called the Square Deal. Now, presidents often come up with a slogan to characterize what they hope to do as president because, like any other politician, they have to sell their idea. And so his Square Deal is what he was calling his progressive reforms. Now, in 1900, Roosevelt's immediate passion was to break up monopolies. Trusts were financial firms controlling entire industries often. And these trusts were controlling about 80% of American industries. Almost all industries were owned by a handful of individuals. And so I'm sure you've heard the rhetoric in the past year that the wealthiest individuals control most of the means of production. And that's what we call an oligopoly. It's different than oligarchy. Oligarchy means a handful of individuals control the government. An oligopoly, an even sillier word, means that a handful of individuals control the means of production. And that's where we were as a country in 1900. And Roosevelt's passion was to change this, to curb the power of the trusts that hurt public interests. Now, he managed to break up some of these using an existing law, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prohibited monopolies from being formed. Roosevelt also intervened personally in a number of labor movements, most famously the 1902 coal strike. When miners went on strike because of their deplorable working conditions, their low pay, their lack of workers' compensation for what is really a very dangerous job. And so they went on strike. Well, coal, especially in 1902, even still today, is an essential industry. With no coal, there would be no power production at this time. With no coal, there would be no steam engines. And so, with this coal strike was actually threatening to cripple the United States economy. And so Roosevelt personally called both sides in, the labor representatives and the representatives of management, and he used his executive order to get them to sit down. And he arbitrated this dispute personally. And he threatened federal takeover of this business were there not a reasonable compromise reached. And so he set a principle here, a federal intervention in the case of business. And really this earned Roosevelt the nickname of Lion Tamer, because he was here portrayed in this cartoon as taming these various lions of businesses. The railroads were one of the most powerful corporations in the United States at this time. They represented the transportation infrastructure. They represented a large percentage of the jobs that were being created in the United States at this time. They were one of the largest purchasers of resources, and they were one of the largest economic drivers in the United States at this time. And so, yes, they were very powerful politically. So powerful, in fact, that one could argue they were buying up politicians. Now, how do you stop that? Well, Roosevelt pushed for federal regulation to control these abuses. And one of these was the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act limited the amount of passes that railroads could offer to politicians. It also created the Interstate Commerce Commission, a federal regulatory body that would set maximum rates on freight. He also pushed for and signed the Elkins Act, which would stop rebates, which again were discounts and free rides, one way that railroads were bribing politicians. And then also it would ban sudden rate changes, because when a monopoly controls an industry, they can charge whatever they want for a good or a service. And these monopolies were doing just that. And now it's time for the federal government to begin to clean that up through legislation. But also the food and drug industry. I don't know if you heard from the clip in the beginning, and I've got a couple more clips to illustrate this. A young journalist named Upton Sinclair decided to take matters into his own hand. He went into journalism because he wanted to change the world. He wanted to expose corruption, just like so many politicians had. He had a very clever idea. He went undercover and he got a job working at a meatpacking industry. His main goal was to expose how immigrants were being exploited in the workplace. He wanted to work alongside immigrants, and he wanted to live the life of an immigrant in the United States, and he documented his process thoroughly. And when he published his work, it was called The Jungle, he hoped for it to be an expose on how we were treating immigrants as second-class citizens and how we were using immigrant labor for our benefit. Teddy Roosevelt once said of this book that Sinclair aimed for the nation's heart, but he hit it in the stomach. Because also contained within The Jungle, and what you're about to see are several excerpts of this book, are vivid descriptions of the nasty ways that our food was being produced. You heard the first clip that the dried dung of rats would fall onto the meat and the workers would just brush it off. How they would set out poison traps for the rats, and the poison and the rats together would fall into the vats where the meat was made, and it would all get churned up together. And how when you break apart ham and you study what is in ham, people were finding rope and pigskin and a number of unsavory products. And that only a very small percentage of it is actually good meat. Most of it is byproduct. Pretty nasty business, really. And when this book was published, there was such an uproar that the president was kind of forced to declare a commission to study this. So, again, there was such a national uproar. People were like, oh my gosh, this is what is in our food? You know, I guess no one had ever really put it into writing before. That there was a presidential commission created to study our food industry, in particular our meat production industry. And unfortunately, they confirmed what Sinclair was writing. They were like, oh, yeah, this is disgusting. And so Roosevelt pushed for and had bipartisan support for a law called the Meat Inspection Act, requiring, number one, sanitary requirements in the workplace and a federal meat inspection program. And so now not only are the restaurants where you eat inspected, but the places that produce the meat that you eat in said restaurants are also inspected. common sense legislation.
Riding the jungle was not Sinclair's idea. He'd published an article in the socialist newspaper, Appeal to Reason, about a workers' strike in Chicago. The newspaper asked him to go back and research a book about wage slavery in the meat industry. In disguise as a working man, Sinclair encountered the real-life characters he'd portray in a jungle.
He was fascinated with the people who were there, with how they looked, with the music, and he made it the material of the jungle. Smart choice.
Now, a year has passed in the lives of Sinclair's newlyweds. Ona and Jorgis have an infant son, but shortly after his birth, the disasters pile on. Jorgis's father, Antonis, sickens from working in a cold, wet factory. He dies. Jorgis barely has time to mourn before he slips on a blood-slicked floor in the killing room. Homebound with a sprained ankle, he loses his job. Now he was second-hand, he realizes. A damaged article. They did not want him. As Jorgis's strength ebbs, so does Ona's innocence.
And when they came to work the next
She confesses to Marija that she's submitted to her boss, a man called Connor. Ona becomes pregnant and can't hide the truth from Jorgis. Mad with rage, the laborer attacks Ona's boss and is thrown in jail. Out of work, behind bars, Jorgis surrenders to despair. Chicago has defeated them. He can't imagine the worst is still to come. Once out of jail, Sinclair's hero, Jorgis Rutgers, plunges into new disasters. His worst fear comes true. The bank has taken the house. Then he finds Ona and Marija in a filthy boarding house. Ona suffers a torturous labor. The infant is stillborn. The ordeal kills Ona. Soon after, the last straw, Jorgis's young son falls through a rotten sidewalk and drowns in the filth beneath. In despair, the laborer simply abandons Chicago and the shattered remnants of his family.
What Sinclair's really done is to sort of roll up a lot of different tragedies into the life of one family. That's probably unrealistic for that amount of tragedy to occur within one family. For these types of situations to develop in a community like Packingtown in one or another family was actually quite common.
Another result of this law is the Pure Food and Drug, of this book, is the Pure Food and Drug Act. Food and drug advertisements are notorious for making false claims and patenting medicines that are unsafe. You know, today, if your doctor prescribes you a medication, you can rest assured that medication has gone through a long period of trials under a great degree of regulation. And if you choose to do so, you can go online and you can read these articles summarizing the research about the particular medication you have been subscribed. You have access to all of that information. However, prior to the Pure Food and Drug Act, you might meet a medicine salesman, and you might go to one of their advertisement shows, and they might be promising you a medicine that would cure all of your problems. Well, don't we all have problems, right? My ankle hurts. My stomach feels upset commonly. I feel irritable and grouchy and all of these things that someone might promise, I have something that will fix it. Now, studies have been done on these, quote, patent medicines, and the most common active ingredient is alcohol. Because, guess what? Alcohol temporarily makes you feel better. And people consume the medicine and then they think, oh, I feel better. My ankle doesn't hurt anymore. My stomach's no longer upset. Oh, there'll be side effects, blah, 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 hangover. Well, anyway, the Pure Food and Drug Act halts by federal law the sale of contaminated food and medicine, but also it requires truth in labeling so that when you get that prescription medication or when the doctor recommends an over-the-counter medication, you can read the label when you go to CVS or Walgreens or wherever, and you can look what is contained in this product. And you can, of course, now go online and what is this chemical? I can't pronounce it. Well, let's Google it and see what is in there. Of course, that's by federal law that you have access to that information.
%99 of Americans are meat eaters, consuming on average about twice their weight in meat each year.
We forget that in the 19th century, meat became a production industry and became industrialized, taken out of the home and taken into the factories.
Canned meat was an experiment in convenience and catastrophe. Around 1900, during the Spanish-American War, some 1,000 Americans died from tainted meat, about 3 times the number killed by the Spanish. Before The Jungle was published in 1906, meat-related deaths seemed to be an inescapable fact of life.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, there are 76 million cases of food poisoning in the United States every year, 332,000 hospitalizations, and 5,000 deaths.
Most of these deaths are caused by a bacteria called E. coli 0157H7. It comes from cattle feces. Cattle carry it into the slaughterhouses. There, it gets into the meat.
Food safety is a shared responsibility. It's got to start with the people who are growing the crops or raising the animals. The people who sell the product through a restaurant or through a grocery store have a responsibility to keep their facilities clean. And then the final food preparer has a responsibility to make sure that they cook foods properly.
Forcing the meat industry to do it right was Upton Sinclair's mission nearly a century ago. He'd achieve it by disguising himself as a worker and infiltrating Chicago's packing houses. It was a risky business, but the circumstances of his own life called for desperate measures.
He had been there. He had felt the cold. He had not been able to buy food. He had had a leaky roof. So he put that into the jungle, that's for sure.
And so here's a photograph of a meat inspection operated by a U.S. government inspector. So what this is verifying is that all meat produced in this factory has been inspected by an objective third party. Next, I want to move on to Roosevelt's conservation measures. In 1887, the United States Forest Bureau was established. And Roosevelt helped set aside 45 million acres of public land to be conserved. That's roughly the size of Germany, the nation. Now, the early 1900s, late 1800s are known as the logging era. And during that time, resource extraction for private benefit was the accepted policy. And resources were being consumed, natural resources were being consumed at an uncontrolled rate for profit. Had nothing been done, we would have no forests. We would have no mountaintops. We wouldn't have all of this beautiful land that we have. And Roosevelt began this movement, helped to begin this movement, to set aside forest reserves and sanctuaries and national parks. You saw him pictured next to Yellowstone. You saw him pictured next to many multiple national parks that he helped to preserve. And I'm forever grateful for that. Now, he believed that these resources were just that, resources. They can still be harvested. The national forest can still be harvested, and it can still be logged. But it must be done under the watchful, resolute eye of the government. It must be done in a controlled manner. Because he believed that conservation was part preservation and part development for public use. Some areas are designated wilderness areas, like Joyce-Kilmer. There are no roads in the Joyce-Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness. In fact, the trails are not even marked. The Shining Rock Wilderness is very similar. You cannot operate a motor vehicle in these wilderness areas. And your access is limited, and it does require some outdoor knowledge to get around safely. Some parks are very developed, with paved roads, with visitor centers, with shows and costumed animals and all kinds of fun things. And it just depends on how it is set aside under the National Reclamation Act. And then finally, civil rights. Civil rights, that is the movement to ensure equal treatment under the law for all, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, or national origin. That was a very politically divisive topic, as it certainly is today. And no president up to this point had publicly stood up for civil rights. Teddy Roosevelt did not support civil rights for African Americans. Though he was one of the first presidents to invite an African American to the White House, Booker T. Washington. So as far as your essay goes, when you're trying to decide whose idea would be more effective, Booker T. Washington was the first of these two individuals to be invited to the White House. Because remember, it was his idea for blacks to keep their heads down. He literally said that, cast down your buckets. He meant, keep. W.E.B. Du Bois, meanwhile, said, no, we need to commit acts of civil disobedience. We need to protest. We deserve equal rights. In fact, Du Bois went on to found the NAACP during Roosevelt's administration, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, whose goal from 1908-9 to the present is full equality among the races. Yet no new laws in regards to civil rights were passed during Roosevelt's term as president. So today we'll be talking about Chapter 17, Section 4, and it's titled Progressivism Under Taft. William Howard Taft succeeded Theodore Roosevelt as President of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, a member of the Republican Party, as was Taft. Roosevelt was so popular that he was able to endorse, support, and see elected a member of his own party after Roosevelt retired. And that's uncommon. In fact, if you look at the history of elections, it's more common for a two-term president to see an overturn in power, such as what we've had in the recent election, where a member of a party serves 2 terms and then the electorate votes a member of a different party in as president. Anyway, so this is not uncommon, but it is interesting that Taft was endorsed and supported by the previous president. However, Taft took the party and took our country in a very different direction, and that's what we're going to be talking about today with the legacy of William Howard Taft. All right, so in 1908, Republican William Howard Taft won the presidency with Roosevelt's support. He promised to follow up and continue Roosevelt's legacy of progressivism, yet he was much more cautious. He was nowhere near as charismatic as Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he has this odd distinction of being our physically largest president, yet was not nearly as imposing as Teddy Roosevelt. So, again, while he promised to continue this legacy, in many ways he was disappointing to his predecessor. So, first off, let's talk about some of his accomplishments. Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. It was meant to be a compromise between the stalwarts, members of the Republican Party that wanted to impose heavy tariffs to restrict foreign trade, to protect domestic industries. But then there were also the progressives who wanted to remove tariffs to use international trade as a means of breaking up monopolies and corruption. And so while it was meant to be a compromise, a moderate tariff, it actually angered members of both parties. The progressives were angry because they feared that he was going to abandon low tariffs and that this was really a slap in the face for the progressive movement. However, where Taft really upset Theodore Roosevelt was over public lands. When Taft named Richard Ballinger to Secretary of the Interior, that's the cabinet level office whose job it is to oversee all public lands. So Pisgah National Forest, the Great Smoky Mountains, the Blue Ridge Parkway, all of these places, all federal lands, are overseen by the Department of the Interior. Now, this is a very important position, and we need to watch closely to see who President-elect Trump is going to appoint as Secretary of the Interior, because this will affect us, these public lands that we use so much, that are such a big part of our county. When Richard Ballinger, for example, was nominated Secretary of the Interior, he placed these reserved lands in the public domain. What this allowed him to do was to sell reserved public lands for profit. Can you imagine? I mean, I do try to remain objective as your history teacher, but I will be marching and protesting if Pisgah National Forest is up for sale. I mean, and I think that's pretty general. We're all going to be upset about that. But that's the sort of thing that was happening here. When Richard Ballinger started putting up public lands for sale to the highest bidder, well, Teddy Roosevelt heard about it. He was actually hunting lions in Africa. He became so upset, he came back. And we're going to talk about his comeback in just a moment. Now, Gifford Pinchot, the man that had managed Pisgah Forest when it was owned by the Vanderbilts, was so upset that Ballinger was placing lands under his supervision up for sale that he publicly protested this. Because he's the head of the Forest Service. That's his job. He testified in court against Ballinger saying that he does not have the right to do this. Well, Ballinger was his boss, and so he fired Pinchot. In fact, this became a famous Supreme Court case, Schneck versus the United States. Carl Schneck was a friend of Pinchot's who took this matter to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in his honor, 276 that goes into Pisgah Forest, next time you're with your family driving up to the parkway, That's called Schneck Highway in his honor because he defended these public lands that we hold so important. So between Taft's messing with our public lands and his support of tariffs, he's causing division within the Republican Party at this time. In fact, the Republicans, which at that time had the reputation of progressivism because that's what Roosevelt had really championed, split over Taft's support of the Speaker of the House, Joseph Cannon. While Roosevelt, once again, had this reputation of being a trust buster, a lion tamer, an aggressive pursuer of social justice, an aggressive pursuer of economic opportunity. He hated monopolies. And he was really the first Republican president of his time to be so outspoken like that. And Taft really represented several steps back. And so that did split the party. Joseph Cannon, Speaker of the House of Representatives, also further weakened the progressive agenda. And so the progressive members of the Republican Party began to ally themselves with the Democratic Party. In fact, today, again, when you think of what does it mean to be a Republican versus what does it mean to be a Democrat, well, it's not so simple as just one thing. You can't just say, oh, these guys believe this, these guys believe this. Both parties represent a coalition of diverse interests. Among the Republicans, you have evangelicals who are hoping for an end to abortion, among many other things. Also among Republicans, you have large business interests. You also have the disenfranchised, angry, poor whites. You also have many other groups. And then among the Democrats, you also have a diverse coalition. You have social justice reformers. You have a number of what some would call wealthy white progressives. You also have a large minority base in the Democratic Party. And so, again, it's a diverse coalition of competing interests who have compromised around these two parties. Well, in 1910, something big happened. Roosevelt had made the Republican Party the progressive party. He was just that charismatic. And Taft had really took a step back. And he had angered the progressives within the Republican Party to such a degree that we see a big shift. The Republican Party after 1910 no longer represented these progressives. They all moved to the Democratic Party. And so from now on, we're going to see the trust busting, the end of those working for social justice, the civil rights, etc. That's all going to come from the Democratic Party after 1910. In the 1910 midterm elections, with the support of the Republican progressives who changed parties, the Democrats got control of the House, and essentially, as you've seen in the past 8 years, or past 6 years to be more exact, when a president has a different party than Congress, it's difficult to get things done. Okay. Taft was so upset, understandably so, that his legacy had been tarnished. That at the 1912 convention, Taft ran against an incumbent. This is uncommon. This is really unheard of. Well, it's possible we could see this. Let's say that Trump is so unpopular as president that the Republican Party turns against him and decides to nominate someone else, maybe Pence, maybe Boehner, maybe Mitch McConnell. I mean, it could be any number of people, leaders within the Republican Party. We could see Rubio come back. You just never know. But it's very uncommon. It's not unheard of that a party can turn against their own incumbent president. In 1912, that happened. That very thing happened. Roosevelt, was planning on retiring. He was a young president. He was a young man. He was going to go travel the world and enjoy some adventures. He's done his civic duty. But no, he comes back. See, in 1912, he ran against the incumbent president for the Republican nomination. And he split the Republican Party by forming his own party. While he lost the Republican nomination because most Republicans chose to support the incumbent, Roosevelt went off and formed his own party. For example, imagine if Trump had lost the nomination. Politics aside, he was threatening to do this very thing. He was threatening to run as an independent. He would have split the Republican nomination. It would have been a very different result. When Roosevelt formed his own party, which essentially split off the progressives that were left in the Republican Party, his call was for more voter participation in government, universal women's suffrage, and legislation to regulate labor and business controls. And so now we really have 3 candidates for president. A lot of my friends and family have been dismayed by the fact that there weren't more options for president. Many felt that no one truly represented their interests. And that can be a difficult thing within a 2-party system. Since these 2 parties have to compromise and collect such a diverse coalition of voters, some people say, well, no one fully represents me. And that's an understandable criticism. That's certainly how my parents felt, and many were dismayed by the lack of options. Well, when you have 3, this can be a difficult situation as well. Because with 3 or more, imagine the Republican primary where you had 12. No one person ever truly got a full majority of the vote. And so what this really did was it split the Republican Party, allowing Woodrow Wilson to have an easy victory. So the election of 1912. Wilson endorsed the progressive platform because now the progressives have joined the Democratic Party. He called his platform the New Freedom. He was going to run on many of the same promises that Roosevelt had already assured. Stronger laws against monopolies, a reform of the banking system, lower tariffs, which would equate to more international trade. But Wilson, like Roosevelt before him, took it that extra step. In fact, he called monopolies evil. Evil. Really, this is some of that populism that we've been hearing in this recent election. That big businesses are controlling the economy, are controlling our government. It was Roosevelt who said, without the watchful, resolute interference of the government, there can exist no fair trade between business and the individual. Now, I've also heard a lot from people saying, I wish there had been more choices. I wish there had been strong third-party candidates. Many people said, well, hey, Gary Johnson seemed interesting. Hey, maybe Jill Stein seemed interesting, but I knew there wouldn't be enough support. We're in a swing state, so you got to go with one of the 2. And that can be frustrating as well. Maybe one of those independents did represent your interest more closely. There was also a strong independent in this race. So in reality, we had, at this time, 4 people in the election of 1912. And to be honest, there were even more, but 4 worth mentioning. You now have Teddy Roosevelt. You now have Taft running for re-election. Woodrow Wilson representing the Democratic Party. And Eugene Debs. Yes, Eugene Debs, the famous labor leader who had formed the American Railway Union, who had led numerous labor strikes. Eugene Debs wanted to run on the Democratic Socialist platform. In fact, he was arguably the first Democratic Socialist to run. And so he actually did manage to get a significant portion of one of the most popular third-party candidates we've ever had. But bottom line, this led to a an overwhelming electoral victory in 1912 for Woodrow Wilson. And when you see an overwhelming victory, and another reality about elections, most people vote down party ticket. I mean, most people wrestle with and think about which party they should join. And then once you do that, most people think, well, it's a simple decision from there of who am I voting for president, and then they just click either all Democrat or all Republican. Most times. That's called down party voting. That's how most people vote. And so when you have an overwhelming victory for someone like Wilson, who was a Democrat, you're also going to see the Democrats take over the House and Senate. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 17, Section 5, and it's called Wilson's New Freedom. And as we talk about Woodrow Wilson, very fascinating president, personally one of my favorites. I know I said that with Teddy Roosevelt, but I think Wilson is amazing for a lot of reasons. He sought to establish a strong reform agenda as a very progressive leader. And I want to give you a little background of Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was raised in a very strict conservative Christian family. He grew up as a Presbyterian. He went on to become a lawyer, was an academic, went on to teach history, in fact, in politics and political science, and decided to get his PhD and become a professor. This man was extremely motivated. Not only did he become a professor, but he was so successful as a teacher and as a university professor that he went on to become president of Princeton University. That is an honor and distinction in itself, and most people would never aspire to anything beyond being the president of one of our most prestigious universities. But Woodrow Wilson was a very ambitious person, and he was also very motivated. And he went on to run for the governor of New Jersey. Now, as governor of New Jersey, this put him in a unique position to consider the nomination for the Democratic candidacy for President of the United States. And we talked about all the drama of 1912 and how the division in the Republican Party paved the way for a Democratic president in 1912. And when he was elected president, he pursued a very similar agenda to what the Republican president Teddy Roosevelt had. And remember, the parties kind of flip-flopped in 1912, where the Republicans had been the progressives. I mean, think 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, three of the most progressive amendments in American history. But after 1912, because really, well, Taft has the distinction of, betraying his predecessor's agenda, and so many of the progressives kind of turned against the Republican Party. And so if you've ever wondered, if you engage in political arguments or if you read about politics, why did the parties flip-flop? Because, here we have Abraham Lincoln, arguably one of the more progressive presidents in American history. So the Republican Party had always been about advancing the cause of civil rights. If you remember, the Civil Rights Act of 1868, 100 years before its time, was pushed through with Republican support. So what was going on there? 1912 explains a lot. And the Democratic Party became the party of progressivism after that time. And so Roosevelt focused on, ironically, many of the very same goals that the Republican Party under Roosevelt had been focusing on, namely trusts, monopolies, tariffs. Remember, taxes on imports were allowing monopolies to form and function free of international trade. And then finally, high finance, reforming the banking industry. And so there are a lot of parallels between what Wilson was seeking to tackle and what we've been discussing in the 2016 election as well. Two of the key measures that Wilson pursued were, number one, monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a landmark piece of legislation in that it outlawed monopolies. However, many monopolies had found loopholes in this law and had continued to function. And remember, Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican, made it his passionate goal to pursue monopolies. And Wilson took that a step further by saying these monopolies are evil and they are hurting not only American trade, but they are hurting the American worker and consumer. And so he pushed through the Clayton Antitrust Act. And this stopped companies from buying up enormous stocks that still exist today to form monopolies. It also protected workers' rights to go on strike by outlawing injunctions. Injunctions were special orders that companies could pass against strikers, which would allow for the National Guard to come in and dispel striking workers. And what Wilson did was protect workers' rights to strike unless they threatened irreparable damage, like physical destruction. And remember when we talked about the labor movement several chapters ago, we also learned how occasionally these strikes and protests would become violent because the National Guard would be called in, because companies would use injunctions, and injunctions mean troops come in, and these workers had no resort except to turn to violence. But again, one of the next big measures adopted by Wilson was the Federal Trade Commission. This is a new watchdog agency. It was set up to investigate regulatory violations and to end unfair business practices. Because you see, it's one thing to have a law, but if you have a law that you know will be contentious, there must be a measure of enforcement, and that's where the Federal Trade Commission comes in. Wilson also pushed through the Underwood Act. This would substantially reduce tariffs. Because remember, tariffs represent a threat to international trade. They were originally intended to protect American industries, and tariffs date back to the earliest parts of American history. But when monopolies were forming, and when companies were unable to compete with firms like Standard Oil or U.S. Steel, I mean, there was no competing with U.S. Steel or Standard Oil or Chase Bank. These companies were so powerful, they controlled their respective industries. And so who is going to compete? How do we have competition? Because isn't competition the hallmark of capitalism? And so that's why reducing tariffs allowed foreign companies to compete with U.S. Steel or Standard Oil. And so the Underwood Act was meant to reduce tariffs so that these foreign companies had a chance to compete with U.S. Steel or Standard Oil. He also set the precedent of giving the State of the Union address in person instead of in a written statement. And Wilson was also well known for using his bully pulpit to get laws passed. All right, so one of the big successes, and it's odd to say that a tax is a success, but the 16th Amendment ratified to the Constitution during Wilson's tenure, signed by President Wilson, legalized a graduated federal income tax. You see, the system of taxation had always been a messy one. The government has to collect revenue, but how do they do it? And this established by constitutional law a federal income tax. But it means a progressive income tax in the sense that poor families don't have to pay as much taxes as wealthy families. When you start working, you're going to fill out a form called a 1040-EZ. And that form, as a young person, when you fill that out, that means you're going to get all of your taxes back because you're not earning enough income to have to pay taxes yet at this point. And I filled out that form for probably my first 10 years as a worker. in the United States. And then, of course, when I got my teaching job, I got paid a little more, and I have to fill out a different form now. And I do pay taxes, which is a chunk. But even though about a third of my income goes to taxes, I respect the intention of this, and I respect the fact that families like my sisters, who only have one person working with 4 kids, they shouldn't have to pay. They just shouldn't. They don't make enough to have to pay to the same degree that my wife and I do, who are both working with no kids. Next, the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System established a private banking system under federal control. And what this did, and continues to do today, is monitor our financial system. It is the Federal Reserve that issues currency. All of your dollar bills say Federal Reserve note. And so now United States currency is protected and backed and managed very carefully by this group. If you remember Andrew Jackson, you may remember him saying, "The Bank of the United States is trying to kill me. I will kill it." That was one of his huge agendas as president, was killing the Bank of the United States. He caused, almost single-handedly, the Panic of 1828. By collapsing the Bank of the United States, he disrupted the economy and caused a depression. Wilson has fixed that in a big way with the Federal Reserve System. And so I wanted to use that little clip to segue into the women's suffrage movement. Because after all, it was Woodrow Wilson who signed the 19th Amendment into law. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. And we've been learning for quite some time, since Chapter 8, about how women had been working for the right to vote, ever since the Seneca Falls Convention, when it became the national goal of the women's rights movement. Women had been working to spread the message and spread the importance of the vote to everyone. This is called a grassroots movement, where we need to get everyone, poor, rich, educated, not, etc., working class, wealthy, everyone needs to get on board with the movement to give women the right to vote. And how did they do this? Well, women and men worked together, going door to door, taking trolley tours, meaning using public transit and taking every opportunity to bug people and talk about their message and convince others and give speeches. For example, regardless of how you felt about the election, if you were involved and if you felt strongly about either candidate, or if you felt very passionate about the election in some way, then don't just turn off that part of you. Don't just stop talking about it. Get involved. There are organizations on both sides of the political spectrum continuing the work that was begun in this election. And I do promise to keep my own partisan politics out of this class. But I do want to let you know I plan to become politically involved. I plan to be more involved even than I have previously. And I do plan on volunteering with political parties and organizations. And I do plan on contributing to, in my own small way, to groups that are working to advance the causes that I believe strongly in. And I already have in some degree, and I have for a long time. But I want to do more. I want to be involved in our community, in our society, because as a citizen, I believe that is my responsibility as part of being a good citizen. And no matter what you believe, I think you should. Because if you believe strongly in whatever it is, don't just vote and leave it at that. Don't just say, "Oh, so-and-so will do that for me." Well, that is how a representative democracy works to some degree. But that's not all of it, because it takes concerned, caring individuals. And that's what these suffragettes, that's what they were called, the women getting the right to vote, suffragettes. That's what they did. You see, they wanted the right to vote. But they weren't just waiting for Carly to take care of it for us. No, they were going door to door. They were traveling. They were giving speeches. They were They were marching. I mean, there's a women's rights march on Washington coming up in the next couple of months. The movement's not over. And there will be possibly over 1 million women marching on Washington. And if that's a movement you believe in, go. We'll figure out school later. Be a part of it. Be a part of something bigger than yourself. Now, hopefully it's not around final exam season, but anyway. Maybe they'll time it around your Christmas break, but who knows? Yeah. Now, I want to talk about some heroes in this movement. Carrie Chapman Catt, who you're going to see played by Hilary Swank in this next clip. She was the head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She strongly believed in organization. You know, it's one thing to express your concern or your delight about a recent election or express your political beliefs. That's certainly an important and valuable part of our society. But where you really get things done is joining groups of like-minded people, that organization. That's how Carrie Chapman Catt was able to get this done. You know, it's the old saying I keep repeating throughout this course: stop complaining, start a revolution. Or join an existing one, because there's probably already one going on. The National Women's Party began to aggressively pressure for the suffrage amendment. Eventually, the First World War, which we'll get into in U.S. too, is going to pave the way for suffrage. Because when the First World War broke out in 1914, women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, National Association of Colored Women, all of these groups saw it as an opportunity to gain public support for their movement. And so all of these women's groups strongly encouraged women to get involved in the war. And now, of course, women weren't involved in combat roles at this time. But with the encouragement of these organizations, women were involved in every other facet of the war. They gave of financially. They worked in war-related industries, freeing up jobs for men to go fight. They served as nurses, as laundresses, as cooks, as drivers, as secretaries, everything you can imagine. And these organizations were encouraging women to get out and to support the war. And you know what that did? That bought the political capital, that gained the public favor for the movement. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women the right to vote. Some of these women even took the movement so far as to adopt very bold tactics of civil disobedience. As I said, Susan B. Anthony was arrested over 100 times for voting illegally. I mean, that takes passion, right? That takes perseverance. That takes a willingness to challenge the status quo. That takes guts. Get yourself thrown in prison over 100 years. Ladies, this woman was arrested over 100 times so that you can vote in our next election. That should be a challenge to you. And young men, I mean, of course the same, right? People died for your right to vote. And you know what? I'm disgusted and disheartened to learn that once again, less than half of Americans voted. You know, and I don't care what you believe. That's your right to choose and your responsibility to choose carefully. But it is your civic duty to vote. I'll leave it at that. Now, from 1912 forward, the Democratic Party became the party of progressivism. And as a presidential candidate, Woodrow Wilson had won the support of the NAACP for being outspoken in favor of the civil rights movement for African Americans. As president, however, he opposed laws to put an end to lynching. Maybe you remember Sojourner Truth. Maybe you've done a project about her. This amazing lady, you know her from the speech, Ain't I a Woman? And she made it her passionate goal throughout her career and her life to pursue an end to lynching. Lynching is an extrajudicial killing by a mob of people. It means angry mob rounding up bad guy and hanging them. But the trouble with that is that's vigilante justice. If you watch your superhero stuff, you know there are often themes in comics that vigilantes are a bad thing. Of course, that's what the Batman series was all about. That's what the recent Superman movie was all about. The vigilantes, while they look cool in the comics, are actually kind of scary and a threat to democracy, because our judicial system is based on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. And the burden of proof lies on the prosecution, not the defender. It should work that way. It is meant to work that way. And yes, that means we let some bad guys go from time to time. But that is our constitutional system. That is the basis of our democratic justice system. Vigilantes represent a threat to that. And what we have seen historically is that lynching targets minorities. Most people lynched in American history were black. And there was no law against lynching until the early 1950s. And so I have to balance praise with criticism. Woodrow Wilson understood that for him to be outspoken against lynching, if he really goes there, he'll lose the support of white Southerners. Because I have to be honest and have to think about our own territory. You see, FDR didn't touch it. Wilson didn't touch this cause. Every Democratic politician knew that to be outspoken for civil rights would be political suicide, would hurt the movement, is how they saw it. Harry Truman, he went there. Harry Truman went there. And he used his executive power to integrate the armed forces. And he, not only as a candidate, but as a president, became outspoken in civil rights. And guess what? Solid South blue turned into solid South red from that point forward. It was a trend that began in 1912 and was finalized in 1948, where Democrats turned Republican as the parties flipped. Wilson knew that would happen if he took those steps as president. In fact, he appointed other white Southerners to the cabinet who extended segregation. So he appointed white supremacists to his cabinet. And the NAACP felt betrayed. And as Wilson defended himself in this cause by saying, no, the progressive movement will die if I become outspoken on civil rights, it doesn't change the fact that he betrayed the NAACP. You know, for example, in this election, I want to tell you how far I went. I don't know about you, but I've read the case files of Roe v. Wade. It's where I went, because so many people vote in an election about abortion. And for many, it's that simple. And I'm not going into that debate, and I'm not opening that can of worms. But I was concerned, and I was interested, and I was like, okay, just to be fair, I want to read what exactly is Roe v. Wade that it needs to be overturned. Ruth Ginsburg, one of the Supreme Court justices who was on the bench and still is, but she was on the bench in 1979 when Roe v. Wade was passed. She has written later that she regrets that this issue has become so political. Because for many, including my family, it's just that simple. And Wilson, also understood, and certainly Truman understood, that when they made it about civil rights, but this is the end of our chapter on progressivism for now. We'll revisit this topic at a later date, because when the First World War broke out, war changes things. You see, when a war breaks out, social causes get put on the back burner. Johnson's War on Poverty was put on the back burner when the Vietnam War broke out. The New Deal was effectively ended by the Second World War, and so on and so forth.